Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of the Outing the Past conference. I know it's been a little bit of a wait, and I'm very excited to finally be able to share this work with you. I also feel lucky to have been able to think about this project a little bit longer, maybe than I would have, or at least in a different way. So I think presenting it now, I have made some exciting adjustments to sort of maybe what I originally proposed. And so I'm really excited actually to be able to, for the first time, share a lot of this work that I've been doing. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a media artist and professor at the University of South Carolina. Most of my work is film and video based. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my practice and this current project and the research that went in behind it. And then this project feels a little unique to me because I'm envisioning this more as a gallery-based installation rather than maybe like a traditional viewing experience, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. So I just want to start talking about the project itself. So I think first, just to get started here, I was thinking about sort of my main, not necessarily a question, but I guess consideration that I had going into this project is working with invisible archives that haunt us. And what I mean by this is actually the beginning of this project for me, which happened many years ago in graduate school, in which I was interested in police presence in pride parades, which then led me back to the archives and thinking through those sort of known events like the Stonewall riot, the Compton cafeteria riots, and things like this. And so I went back and I thought, as a filmmaker, I wanted to see what film recordings had been done of these events. And I started with the Stonewall riots, thinking that this was sort of one that I knew was well documented, and I knew that had there were newspaper clippings, there were photographs. There's been many documentaries about Stonewall riots, and I've seen some of that archival footage. So I went down this rabbit hole of several years of looking for this footage, and I couldn't find it. So I'm not necessarily thinking that it doesn't exist. But what the conclusion I came to wasn't interesting to me that, maybe I wasn't looking hard enough or asking the right questions or asking the right people. And I did spend quite a bit of time looking for it, but was thinking about just how inaccessible it has become. So I'm someone who has time and resources to dig into these archives, but that there's still something that resonated with me in just thinking about the difficulty in finding that history, right? So, and there are more things accessible, photographs and things like this, but I know there must have been TV news cameras and all these sorts of things, and I was wondering if what had happened, or if it wasn't saved, or if it was and it's locked away somewhere. And so all these sorts of things led me to that concern, which is working with invisible archives that haunt us. While I was looking for the archives, I found another archive that was very well documented. So if you're not familiar, the Bay Area Television Archive documented riots and news reports surrounding the May 21st, 1979 White Night riots, which broke out within San Francisco after a lenient sentencing to Dan Brown, who murdered openly gay officials, including Harvey Milk. And so this riot that broke out, this sort of protest that broke out, was completely well documented within this archive online, and is still there and is a great resource if you're looking for something. So I started thinking about using these archives in some sort of way and thinking about how they could stand in for these archives that don't exist. So as I was working with them, this is when I started thinking more about this idea of haunting archives and how it might impact me and my work. So again, once I discovered these archives that documented the White Night riots, I started thinking more about this project and the directions that I wanted to go. And so I'll pause and sort of back up here and say that the name pattern still hasn't come into play yet. But first, I wanted to start a little bit with this quote from a book called Ghostly Matters by Avery F. Gordon. And so I wanted to read this quote for you here just to give you an idea of sort of my entrance into this project. So it reads, "Following the ghosts is about making a contact that changes you and refashions the social relations in which you are located. It is about putting life back in where only a vague memory or a bare trace was visible to those who bothered to look. It is sometimes about writing ghost stories, stories that not only repair representational mistakes, but also strive to understand the conditions under which a memory was produced in the first place, towards a counter-memory for the future." So this is something that I sort of held on to as I was working with this, what I'm calling right now a video essay piece. And so I was thinking about what angle I could come in. So there's a lot of narrative that happens when we look at these archival footage, especially of riots and things like this. And so for me, I sort of want to resist these sort of traditional ideas of narrative and story. I'm more interested in thinking through different ways of communicating experiences of the past in particular, right? And thinking about what I have access to describe as well. And so the piece then focused a little bit on these linear patterns that I was noticing within the footage. So the footage itself, which is footage that has been interlaced rather than progressive, which is like a very sort of media heavy explanation of, if you've ever looked at old films and seen those like lines that dart across the image, it's called interlacing. And so a lot of older footage that was shot on VHS, or even just older digital footage, will be interlaced and that leaves a digital artifact of sort of those lines going back and forth. So I was interested in that texture that was there. And to me, these sort of like haunting, these ghostly images, these things, I felt it really within the materiality of the images on the archive. And that was something that interested me. The other thing that I was looking for when I was going through the archive was the ways in which the police formed a line. And this is quite common, right? Anytime there's any sort of crowd control. So you have both the metal barriers that create a line that contains or prevents folks from crossing over a certain line. And then you also have a line, usually a police barricade type of line. So which that is very different. So in addition to exploring these linear, what I'm referring to as these patterns, both within the texture of the film or video file and within the setup of the police and the barricades. And then also, if we're thinking about, we can also extend this to thinking about pride parades being another linear sort of event. But in this case, that is kind of where these protests end, at least in sort of the United States Western history of the, Stonewall riots and other sort of riots leading into what we now know as pride parades. But this project more so focuses on gaps in those histories, things that are forgotten, things that are left out, right? So at the very beginning of this, I talked a little bit about my initial interest in the police presence within the pride parades, and this was another sort of gap, I think, where I was thinking about the role that the police played in the initial raids, and then versus now the police presence in the pride parades. And so that sort of transformation became another interest of mine as I worked on this project. And so in addition to thinking about those linear patterns, and I was thinking about sort of like the haunting, the memory, the gaps in that knowledge. And I wanted to focus in thinking about that through specifically the material that I was working with, which was, again, this archival footage that was lower quality. It had been uploaded to a website. I downloaded it. It had sort of this graininess to it. But that seemed to me to be something of like a haunted image for me some sort of like memory. It's sort of there, it's all over the image, it's unavoidable, and it does in its own way sort of reference its journey, right? When you upload and you download something, it's traveling through servers and across, different forms of transferring data through computers, and you're downloading it, and those artifacts is actually what you're seeing a lot of the time. So this grainy sort of texture, and that to me was the ghost, that was the haunting, that was the memory, and that is maybe sort of how I wanted to tell this ghost story. And so I have been working with this footage almost exclusively, except for the end, which we'll talk about in a second. But I had been working with this footage and thinking about the linearity of this in terms of the lines and the barriers, and then more so sort of the texture of the film, and allowing that to speak for these gaps, both in the archive, both sort of like these sort of like invisible spaces that are so charged with actually so much information. And so I wanted to share a little bit about this by just showing you sort of the clip. And so, as I had mentioned, everything that you see is taken from the Bay Area television archives, except for the last portion of it, which is something that I filmed, and speaks to sort of more the modern day version of police presence. So yeah, I'm gonna play that, and then I'm looking forward to the Q&A after. Thank you very much.